The story of Dorothy Dandridge begins not in the shimmering heat of a Hollywood premiere, but in the industrial grit of Cleveland, Ohio, in 1922. Born Dorothy Jean Dandridge, she entered a world that was already structurally designed to limit her. Her father, Cyril, a cabinet maker and Baptist minister, walked out on the family before Dorothy was even born. This left her mother, Ruby Dandridge, a woman of immense ambition and artistic fire, to raise Dorothy and her older sister, Vivian, on her own. Ruby was not content with a domestic life. She saw the stage as a sanctuary and a ladder. From the time Dorothy could walk, she was being groomed for the spotlight. Ruby created an act for her daughters called the Wonder Children. It wasn't just a cute hobby. It was a survival mechanism during the Great Depression. The girls toured the Chitlin Circuit, a series of venues safe for black performers in a segregated America. While other children were learning their ABCs, Dorothy was learning how to hold a note, how to time a joke, and how to command an audience that had very little to give but their applause. However, the discipline behind the talent was often dark. Ruby's companion and the girls' handler, Geneva Williams, was a strict taskmaster. Known for a quick temper and a heavy hand, Geneva pushed the girls toward perfection with a ruthlessness that left deep emotional scars. Dorothy would later recount that she felt she never truly had a childhood. She was a miniature professional, a polished product before she was even a person. This early exposure to the business of show business gave her the armor she would later need for Hollywood. But it also sowed the seeds of an eternal, restless seeking for the love and stability she missed in her youth. As the 1930s rolled on, Ruby moved the family to Los Angeles, sensing that the burgeoning film industry held the key to their fortune. The Wonder Children evolved into the Dandridge sisters, with the addition of a third member, Etta Jones. The trio was a powerhouse of harmony and grace, quickly gaining a reputation that transcended the local circuit. They weren't just singers, they were a sophisticated package of glamour that challenged the era's narrow perceptions of black femininity. The sisters began landing uncredited roles in major motion pictures, often appearing as specialty acts. You can spot a young, radiant Dorothy in the Marx Brothers classic A Day at the Races, or alongside Bill Bojangles Robinson in the Big Broadcast of 1936. These were brief glimpses, but they were enough to spark a fire in Dorothy. She didn't want to be part of a background tapestry. She wanted the camera to stay on her. The group eventually reached the pinnacle of the live entertainment world, the Cotton Club in Harlem. It was here that Dorothy first truly understood her power. The Cotton Club was a place of high contradiction, a venue where black excellence was celebrated on stage, but the audience remained strictly white. Performing there meant you had arrived, but it also meant standing face to face with the glass ceiling of American racism. It was also at the Cotton Club where Dorothy's personal life would take a turn that changed her trajectory forever. While performing at the Cotton Club, Dorothy met the man who would become her first husband, Harold Nicholas. Harold was one half of the legendary Nicholas brothers, arguably the greatest tap dancers to ever live. He was charming, world-famous, and lived a life of nomadic luxury. For a young woman who had spent her life under the thumb of her mother and Geneva, Harold represented freedom. They were the it couple of the black entertainment world, beautiful, talented, and seemingly unstoppable. They married in 1942 in a lavish ceremony that felt like a Hollywood ending. But the reality of their union was far from a fairy tale. Harold was a man of the world, accustomed to the adoration of many women and the lack of domestic ties. Dorothy, conversely, craved a home. She wanted the stability she had never known. As Harold continued to tour the world, Dorothy found herself increasingly isolated in their Los Angeles home, waiting for a husband who was often more interested in the next show than his young wife. The cracks in the marriage deepened with the arrival of their daughter, Carolyn Suzanne Nicholas, in 1943. What should have been a moment of ultimate joy became a source of lifelong agony. The birth was difficult, and due to a series of tragic delays in getting Dorothy to the hospital, partly because Harold had taken their only car to go golfing, Carolyn suffered severe brain damage. The diagnosis of cerebral anoxia meant that their daughter would never speak or be able to care for herself. The tragedy of Carolyn's condition fractured what was left of Dorothy's marriage. Harold, unable or unwilling to deal with the reality of a disabled child, became even more distant. Eventually, he simply walked away, leaving Dorothy to handle the immense emotional and financial burden of Carolyn's care alone. For Dorothy, The pain was doubled by a crushing sense of guilt. She blamed herself for the delay in the birth, convinced that if she had been stronger or faster, her daughter would have been healthy. She poured every cent she made into private care for Harlan, desperate to find a cure that didn't exist. This financial pressure forced Dorothy to work harder than ever, but it also made her more selective. She was tired of the maid roles and the caricatures Hollywood offered black actresses. She began to refine her solo act, working with vocal coaches and stylists to transform herself into a sophisticated supper club chanteuse. This was the birth of the Dorothy Dandridge we remember, the Bronze Venus. She began playing high-end rooms like the Mocambo and the Waldorf Astoria's Empire Room, becoming the first black woman to headline there. She was selling a specific brand of elegance, one that was sultry yet refined, dangerous yet distant. She was proving that a black woman could be a leading lady, a sex symbol, and a sophisticated artist all at once. Hollywood was finally starting to pay attention, but they didn't know what to do with her. In 1954, director Otto Preminger was looking to cast a film version of the Broadway hit Carmen Jones, an adaptation of Bizet's opera Carmen set in an all-black, modern-day context. Preminger was a notoriously difficult man, and when he first met Dorothy, he dismissed her. He thought she was too refined, too middle-class for the role of the fiery, tempestuous Carmen. He suggested she play the role of Cindy Lou, the good girl foil to the lead. Dorothy refused to accept that. She knew this was the role she was born for. She went home, let down her hair, donned a tight skirt and a low-cut blouse, smeared on a heavy layer of red lipstick, and practiced a look of predatory confidence. She returned to Preminger's office and walked in not as Dorothy Dandridge, the polite singer, but as Carmen. Preminger was stunned. He saw the fire, the sexuality, and the raw talent he had previously missed. He gave her the part on the spot. Carmen Jones became a cultural phenomenon. Dorothy's performance was electric. She was vibrant, tragic, and utterly captivating. When the film was released, she became an overnight global superstar. She was the first black woman to grace the cover of Life magazine, and suddenly, the world seemed to be at her feet. The success of Carmen Jones culminated in a moment that would change film history. In 1955, Dorothy Dandridge became the first African-American woman to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. It was a staggering achievement in an era when Jim Crow laws still governed much of the country. She wasn't being nominated for a supporting role as a servant or a comic relief. She was being recognized as the best leading actress in the world. The night of the Oscars was a swirl of flashbulbs and fur. Dorothy looked every bit the queen of Hollywood. But underneath the glamour was the bitter irony of her reality. She was nominated for the highest honor in her profession, yet she still struggled to find a hotel in certain cities that would allow her to stay as a guest. She was the toast of the town, but the town's rules still considered her a second-class citizen. She didn't win that night. The Oscar went to Grace Kelly. But the nomination itself felt like a victory for an entire race. However, the victory was short-lived. Instead of opening doors to even greater roles, the nomination seemed to freeze her career. Hollywood didn't have black scripts for leading ladies. They didn't know how to cast a black woman as a romantic lead opposite a white man, and they weren't ready to let her carry a film without the all-black cast gimmick. During the filming of Carmen Jones, Dorothy began a complicated and ultimately destructive affair with Otto Preminger. Preminger was white, married, and powerful. In the 1950s, an interracial relationship was not just a scandal. In many states, it was illegal. Their love affair was one of Hollywood's worst-kept secrets, and it was marked by Preminger's controlling nature. He advised her to turn down roles he felt were beneath her new status as an Oscar nominee. He wanted her to wait for the big roles, the ones that would cement her as the Black Elizabeth Taylor. Dorothy followed his advice, turning down supporting roles in major films like The King and I. But the big roles never came. While her white contemporaries were moving from one leading role to another, Dorothy's phone stayed silent. The affair with Preminger was also physically and emotionally draining. He reportedly pressured her into an abortion when she became pregnant, fearing the scandal would ruin both their careers. By the time the relationship ended, Dorothy was left with a stalled career and a broken heart. She had traded her momentum for the promises of a man who could never truly give her the life she wanted. In 1957, Dorothy finally landed a role that challenged the status quo. Island in the Sun. The film featured an interracial romance between Dorothy's character and a white man played by John Justin. It was groundbreaking, but the studio was terrified of the backlash. They filmed the romance with such caution that the two actors were never even allowed to kiss. Despite the watering down of the plot, the film was met with outrage in the South. Threats were made against theaters that showed it. For Dorothy, it was a reminder that no matter how famous she became, she was always a lightning rod for racial tension. She was tired of being a pioneer. She just wanted to be an actress. Her next major project, Porgy and Bess, 1959, was another prestige production, reuniting her with Preminger and starring Sidney Poitier. While Dorothy gave a powerful performance as Bess, the film was criticized by many in the Black community for its stereotypical depictions of poverty and drug addiction. Dorothy felt trapped between a white industry that only saw her as an exotic other and a Black community that expected her to be a perfect representative of the race. As the 1960s began, Dorothy's personal life took a disastrous turn. She married Jack Dennison, a white restaurant owner who many of her friends believed was a gold digger. Dennison was reportedly abusive and mishandled her finances with shocking negligence. He pressured her into investing her life savings into his failing restaurant. And when the business went under, Dorothy's fortune went with it. The marriage ended in a bitter divorce in 1962. Dorothy was left nearly penniless. The IRS began hounding her for unpaid taxes, and the expensive private care for her daughter, heroin, became an impossibility. In one of the most heartbreaking moments of her life, Dorothy was forced to commit heroin to a state institution. The daughter she had spent 20 years trying to protect was now a ward of the state because Dorothy could no longer afford to keep her safe. The loss of her daughter, her money, and her career sent Dorothy into a deep depression. She began to drink heavily and became reliant on antidepressants. The woman who had once been the most glamorous star in Hollywood was now living in a small apartment, struggling to make ends meet by performing in low-rent lounges and taking bit parts in foreign films. By 1965, there were whispers of a comeback. Her former manager, Earl Mills, was trying to organize a new tour and a book deal for her autobiography. Dorothy seemed to be finding a spark of her old self, but the weight of the past was heavy. On September 8, 1965, Earl Mills went to Dorothy's apartment in West Hollywood after she failed to answer his calls. He found her lying on the floor, dead at the age of 42. The initial report suggested she died of a blood clot caused by a fractured foot she had suffered days earlier. However, a later toxicology report concluded that she had died of an accidental overdose of tofranil, a common antidepressant. Some speculated it was suicide. Others believed her body simply gave out under the stress of years of struggle. When her bank account was settled, the woman who had once been a millionaire and an Oscar nominee had only $2 to her name. Dorothy Dandridge was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, but her story didn't end there. For decades, her legacy was largely forgotten by the mainstream until a new generation of actresses began to tell her story. In 1999, Halle Berry starred in the biopic Introducing Dorothy Dandridge, a project Berry fought for years to produce. When Berry won her own Best Actress Oscar in 2002, she explicitly dedicated the moment to Dorothy, the woman who had kicked in the door 47 years earlier. Dorothy Dandridge's life was a series of firsts that came at an unimaginable cost. She was the first to reach the summit, only to find that the world wasn't ready to let her stay there. She was a woman of immense complexity, a devoted mother who lost her child to the system, a romantic who was betrayed by the men she loved, and an artist who was never allowed to reach her full potential. Her story is a reminder that the golden age of Hollywood had a very different hue for those who weren't white. She played the game by their rules, she achieved their highest honors, and yet she was still discarded when her presence became inconvenient. But in the flickering frames of Carmen Jones, we see a woman who refuses to be ignored. We see a fire that no amount of tragedy could fully extinguish. Today, Dorothy Dandridge is recognized not just as a tragic figure, but as a pioneer of dignity. She paved the way for every Black actress who has followed, proving that beauty and talent are universal, even if the industry isn't. She remains the Bronze Venus, a star that burned too bright for a world that preferred the dark, leaving behind a legacy of elegance that continues to inspire.